Hi everyone, I'm Yvette Russell, Senior Lecturer in Law and Feminist Theory at the University of Bristol, or the France of England, as I heard it described this week. And it's really nice to be here in Bristol talking about revolutionary praxis in my seminar today. But before I start, I'd like to thank my friend Ellen Wall and his colleagues at the Warwick Centre for Critical Legal Studies, and also our friends at Critical Legal Thinking for organising this amazing seminar series, which I'm really delighted to be a part of. And this is particularly so because, as Stacey Douglas said in her seminar, we didn't get to see our friends at CLC last year, though I do hope to be eating my body weight in fried bars at the rescheduled CLC in Dundee later this year. So I wanted to talk today about some recent work of mine, which is trying to rethink what resistance to rape means, or how we resist and prevent rape and other forms of sexual violence. And this is related to a broader interest, theoretical interest I have in the relationship in women's studies or feminist philosophy between theory and politics, or theory and praxis. And this relationship is quite important or contentious in rape studies because of the urgency of the issues that we're dealing with and the perception that ultimately theoretical work doesn't help us that much to solve these issues, or it's a distraction from the work of politics. And I think it's important to contest this type of thinking, but more importantly, to resist the sharp dichotomy between theory and politics in rape studies and in activism. And I argue that we really need to see theory and practice as co or mutually constitutive, particularly when we're talking about why rape happens and what we should be doing about it. And this might seem like an uncontroversial, straightforward point, but I don't see resistance thought in critical rape scholarship with the same robustness that we see in the diagnostic phase of the work, or in the phase that talks about why rape happens and why it remains so impervious to legal and other kinds of reforms. So in order to make this link between theory and praxis, we need to start with the diagnosis of the problem. And feminists have talked for decades about why rape happens, what the wrong or the harm of rape is, why the law fails to protect us from rape. And many of you, depending on where you're watching, will be familiar with feminist complaints around attrition in the criminal justice system of rape and sexual violence statistics. And in England and Wales, we have a quarterly statistics bulletin, which the last two bulletins that have come out show that prosecutions of sexual offences are currently at the lowest rate they've been since records have been taken. And this has led a lot of commentators, including the Victims Commissioner recently, to claim that sexual violence has effectively been decriminalised. And this is a similar refrain that we hear in a lot of Western legislatures, which have a similar legislation to ours, a similar common law systems, but indeed also this attrition problem happens in civil law jurisdictions. And this is of concern to feminists, and not just for obvious reasons, but because much of the legislation and policy reform over the last 50 years has been enacted with the support and input of feminist scholars and activists. So it's of interest to us, why this has failed, why the law continues to reign so impervious to the problem of sexual offences and sexual violence. So it's in this context that I approach the matter of resistance to rape, which also is in the context of the political present, which is profoundly characterised by inequality, by state violence and repression, and where we can now see the cracks, if not the outright breakdown, of many aspects of the social contract. So how to proceed from this point? Well, if we're to understand what it means to resist rape in this context, we need to know what it is we're resisting. And feminists and criminal lawyers disagree on this point. So that is to say, they disagree on what the precise harm or wrong of rape is, why rape happens, why it happens predominantly to women, why it is predominantly perpetrated by men, and why the law doesn't seem able to do much about any of these things. So it's useful to start perhaps with how the law tells us we should see the harm or wrong of rape. And the law provides us with a very narrow framework through which to understand or think about the harm or wrong of rape. And that is, it conceives the harm as a violation of autonomy or of sexual autonomy. And consent is a concept or tool through which, or the primary gateway through which we exercise or are able to exercise this right of autonomy. So the idea is that we own the property in our body and that we exercise autonomy by consenting. So either withholding consent or giving consent to other people to access our body. Now, there's been a lot of criticism of this formulation of the harm of rape because the conception of personhood upon which this idea of harm relies is profoundly or symbiotically tied to property. And within this type of framework, the value of the harm of rape and therefore the likelihood that a case will proceed through the criminal system depreciates the farther away the facts of the case are from the classic real rape scenario. And that's because the wrong is conceived as an invasion or appropriation of property, the body, without consent. So in cases where the perpetrator's former intimate or where there's little evidence of bodily injury, the damage to the person is harder for the law to recognise, or the law is less willing to recognise that harm. And we know that these cases of what we call simple rape are most cases of sexual violence. But what this type of framing that I've described of around autonomy and consent also ignores is that the harm of rape is profoundly gendered harm. And if we're to understand the nature of the harm, we need to understand it as a gendered harm. So I understand rape through predominantly a psychoanalytic framework. And I think that this helps explain the link between the gendered harm and what we call the monosexuate or singular symbolic order, in which all difference is effectively reduced to a derivative, or a complement, or an aberration of the masculine. So in a symbolic order in which is dominated by the masculine subject, the whole social scene ends up being constituted as isomorphic with masculine being. So it mirrors masculine being. And this isomorphism is also present, not just in ontology, but also in knowledge, language, systems of signification. These all come to privilege the masculine morphology. And women are represented in this social system under the category of the neutral universal subject, which is in fact the masculine subject, the white masculine subject. So in this order, women are erased in their singularity, in their sexuate singularity. But paradoxically, they also serve as the material, the matter, or the dwelling upon and in which men construct themselves and their own world. So women end up only being able to be represented or materialized insofar as they serve the masculine projection of wife or mother, and out of which a man reproduces himself. And this is why Luce Irigaray talks about desire, and particularly masculine desire, as essentially homosexual, and that woman functions as a specular object or mirror that simply reflects man back to himself. So in this case, there isn't true heterosexual desire between two different subjects. There's a masculine projection reflected back to himself, hence this idea of homosexual desire. So if we're to imagine ourselves outside this current framework of what we might call sexual indifference, which supports rape culture, we have to think about what independent sexuate subjectivity for both men and women would mean if it wasn't derived from the neutral universal subject, which masquerades as universal and is predicated on the erasure of women's difference, or any kind of difference. Now, importantly, the project I'm describing doesn't involve discerning some essential characteristics of womanhood or manhood or femininity or masculinity, in which one comes to define the other. Instead, it's about looking for the conditions or the ways of knowing, so different epistemologies under which different subject positions might emerge in their own singularity. So how this would happen and how these subjectivities would manifest themselves or reveal themselves outside the current dimorphic confines in which sexual difference is only conceived as genital or reproductive difference is ultimately unknown. We can't know how that would reveal itself. And for this reason, we might think that sexual subjectivity will be at least two. So we might say there might be a masculine and feminine subject position. There could be other subject positions. And it's also why there's radical implications for how we think about desire and how we think about sexuality. Because if we were freed from gender restrictions into sexual difference, where there was at least two different subject positions instead of just one, how would we know how desire would reveal itself, heterosexual or homosexual? So there are very radical implications of how of thinking difference as outside the one subject that we currently have. And in some of my work, I've tried to link this type of harm, or seeing this type of harm, and the way it reveals the way that law contributes to maintaining this type of symbolic order. And indeed, I've argued, is invested in this neutral universal subject and the erasure of difference, and particularly feminine difference. And this is because difference, and particularly women's difference, represents a plural form of thinking and being, which becomes a fundamental challenge to the unitary logic, which lends legal discourse its coherence. Peter Goodrich has written a lot about this in his earlier work. So how do we talk about resistance from this diagnosis? Well, I would argue that if we're to fathom the harm of rape in this way and to begin to understand how to resist it, we need to do the work of deconstructing the neutral universal subject. But also we have to do the work of thinking what two or at least two subjects would look like instead of one masquerading as two. So you might notice immediately that if we think about the way that some traditional resistance to rape in legal discourse is conceptualized as, for example, working with judges or police on consent training or unconscious bias around rape myths, for example, this doesn't really correspond with or speak to the problem as I've constructed it here. But there is a small body of feminist philosophy that does try and think creatively from a diagnosis of sexual violence as what it calls an embodied problem, which is slightly different to how I'm framing it. But one that's related to the coding of men's bodies, men's embodiment, for example, as aggressive, as acquisitive, as virile, the penis being coded as a weapon, for example, and women's bodies as passive, as receptive, as violable. So what this work does is it tries to think or rethink women's motility or morphology, for example, in a way that makes it less coded as always already rapeable. And one way that this was done, particularly around the early 2000s, it was quite popular at that time, particularly in the North American philosophical scholarship, is to think about feminist resistance to rape as self-defense training. And this is talked about a lot by the American philosopher Anne Cahill and also Sharon Marcus, as a kind of embodied solution to an embodied problem. So where the bodies of men and women are kind of coded with these attributes which make them, either the perpetrator or the victim. And what we need to do to resist is to rethink that coding, or to undo that coding. And Nicola Gavey, who is another really important critical rape scholar, did some really interesting, important archival work around 2009, looking at the history of the women's movement in the United States around the 60s and 70s, and looking at self-defense training as consciousness raising, and looking at the long history of the women's movement of self-defense training as a way to respond to the threat of rape. So there is a long history of thinking about this of self-defense training. I'm critical of this strain of work in my recently published work, And this is because I don't think that this strategy for resistance, self-defense, is adequately supported by a robust theoretical framing. And I don't think that self-defense follows logically from the diagnosis of the problem, as I've diagnosed it, and indeed as these other scholars have as well. It's an embodied problem. And indeed, in some ways, I think that self-defense as a strategy of resistance ends up reiterating the logic of sexual indifference or of the neutral universal subject that we're trying to get away from. And this is because it involves, at its heart, I would argue, a reversal of the current paradigm rather than its deconstruction. So what is proposed is women taking on aspects of masculine motility and retraining their bodies as strong resisting machines with the strength and power to ready them to fight off rape. And the problem here, I think, is that the strength and power that we're talking about here is taken from within an existing paradigm that's been constructed without reference to women's morphology, their sexuality, or their desire. And reversing this paradigm, or whereby women become strong and powerful and aggressive, and men become passive and weak, doesn't fix or disrupt the logic of rape at its heart. It doesn't challenge the norms of heterosexual desire in any meaningful way. So if we are to think resistance, I argue that we really need to do so in a way that addresses the problems that lead to rape. And for this reason, I argue that we have to do the very difficult work of thinking the difference, or of thinking the subject outside of the possessive paradigm in which we all remain mired, and in which our scope for the possibilities of our embodiment remain mired. So related to this, I argue that we shouldn't necessarily take rape or the act of sexual violence as our point of departure for resistant practice. Rather, resistance needs to be seen as part of revolutionary feminist praxis that's anti-racist, anti-capitalist, and decolonial. And that's because the prevalence and ubiquity and resilience of sexual violence and rape culture is inextricably tied to these oppressive forces, and that they too are predicated on the alienation of the subject in possession and the erasure of difference, and in particular of the erasure of feminine difference. Now, how I see this progressing manifests in two important key ways. So we need to situate, I argue, the importance not just of a singular or differentiated sexual subjectivity, which is not derived from one subject position, the neutral universal subject position. We also need to think the difference. And in doing so, we need to understand and center erotic transformation as profoundly important to revolutionary praxis, and importantly, as decolonial work. And that's because colonial logic at a very profound level continues to shape and structure the development of sexual subjectivities and unconscious drives and desires. And these drives and desires constitute the scaffolding, as Nicola Gavey would say, that supports the rape culture in which we currently live. So in my recent work, I think that we can learn a lot from indigenous feminist movements, which are dealing with the denigration and erasure of the feminine and their cultures due to colonization. And I want to talk about a little bit about Maori feminist decolonial work now, because I know a lot about it, and because it occurs to me that the work that Maori feminist scholars are doing, looking at decolonizing their own lives and the feminine in their culture, very much situates resistance to rape as revolutionary decolonial praxis, and that's what I am interested in. So there is by now a large body of scholarship that looks or insists on the importance of understanding the denigration and erasure and violence against Indigenous women as central to the colonial project. And we can see through various analyses that the genocidal logic of colonialism is almost always accompanied, and almost always the first thing that happens on first contact is the imposition of sharp binary between men and women. And this involves the erasure of women's difference from men, as well as non-binary gender expression and the privileging of the masculine. And this it also leads itself to epistemic violence, and including in the rewriting of indigenous cosmogony and ethnography, which often denigrates and erases the roles of women. And this, through a lot of indigenous societies, has really had a profound impact on the position of indigenous women in the colony and the post-colony. And a lot of scholarship links an upsurge in violence and sexual violence against indigenous women in colonial and post-colonial societies to this process of epistemicide and to the erasure of the importance of the feminine in indigenous cultures. So a lot of indigenous feminist scholarship then is about acknowledging this epistemicidal violence and prioritizing the need to rehabilitate and reclaim lost knowledges and practices. And in Maori scholarship, this has meant thinking about a theoretical framework or kaupapa Maori that's informed by the lived experience of Maori in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and by mātauranga Maori, which is Maori epistemology. And I'm just going to share a little glossary for you, which might be helpful when I'm talking about these words. Share screen. There we go. What's been really important in Māori feminist scholarship is to try and think about or reclaim what womanhood means, or what the feminine means, and indeed what's been lost. And one of these, what's important to this is to try and think Māori women's epistemology, or mātauranga wahine, which it's called. And one kind of concept that's used to talk about this in Māori scholarship is this concept of mana wahine. And what's really interesting about this concept is it has no, or had no meaning. It wasn't used prior to colonization because there wasn't any need to assert that that women had mana, which I'll go on to talk about what mana means. Because everyone was said to have mana, all people, and also everything in society as well has its own type of mana. So when we talk about mana, it doesn't necessarily have a direct translation into English, as a lot of Māori words don't. But it's said to convey a kind of spiritual or interpersonal influence or charisma or authority. It also refers to a generative power, which is quite important, which connects every form of activity in life in Māori society, and is created by the relationship between people and between all elements of cosmogony, the spiritual, and of genealogy as well. Genealogy is really important in Māori culture. And this notion of wahine, which is usually translated to mean women, but as Leonie Piama talks about in this quote, has a much wider meaning that kind of defies translation again into English. So this is her talking, Leonie. Wa relates to notions of time and space, and hine relates to a feminine essence. The term wahine designates a certain time and space for Māori women, but it is by no means a universal term, like the term woman in English. There are many times and spaces that Māori women move through in our lives. Wahine is one of them. There are others. There are varying terms that relate to times in our lives and relationships. From birth, we begin a journey through these many aspects, or through these many spaces. As such, the term wahine should not be seen as a dualism with the term tane, which is man, as we see in the constructed binaries of female and male that exist in the West, and which are defined in biological terms. And this is really important, I think, because it situates the idea of wahine as one way of thinking about women in its own temporal vortex, But also it's outside, again, this diamorphic construct that we have in Western terms as well, and which I've been critical of, which limits the idea of difference to biology or to reproductive difference. And that really is what we're trying to get away from. So I'll just move down here. This is some of the terms that I'm using to talk about. I've already talked about mātauranga, which is epistemology. So mana wahine scholarship and activism is really interesting, I think, for a number of reasons. And I don't have enough time to go through everything today, though I do talk about this in detail in a paper that I've recently published, if you're interested. But there are a number of aspects about trying to rehabilitate mana wahine or mātauranga wahine from this knowledge. And one really important part of this is around cosmogony, much of which has been revised by colonial ethnographers and anthropologists, which erases the important role of the feminine in mātauranga Māori and in tikanga Māori, which is kind of ethics or law or custom. I'm not going to go into the Māori creation story in detail. It is quite a lengthy story, but suffice it to say that feminine and feminine energy is really profoundly central to the way that Māori see the world, to the way that they see their movement towards Aotearoa, the way that they see the kind of the beginning of the universe, the way that they conceive of the beginning and the end of the universe, and the way that they see the relationship between this time and space and this, I guess, our time on Earth and what happens when we leave Earth or when we die. And importantly to highlight is that the first human in Māori cosmogony is born of a woman, and it's shaped from the red clay or menstrual blood of Papatua Nuku, who's understood as kind of the earth mother of in Māori cosmogony. And this person is described, or human, first human woman, is described as having or possessing a very powerful sexual force. And it's her that conceives and bears the first human life, who's also a woman. So this idea of the feminine at the beginning of the Māori creation story is characterized by a number of Māori scholars as all-encompassing, as potent, and as unassailable. That's how Ani Makaire describes it. So as potent and all-encompassing and unassailable. But really importantly, I think it's a sexuate energy. It derives from the unique and singular sexuate energy of the feminine. So the feminine is important here in cosmogony, but also in other aspects of tikanga and Māori custom. And one of this is, an example that I'll give is this distinction between tapu and noa I'm talking about here. So these are quite important concepts in Māori spirituality. So tapu is said to recognise the inherent value of every person, though levels of tapu can vary depending on the person's lineage, their whakapapa, and their roles. It can also connote a prohibition, a spiritual prohibition, and a protection, and it can apply in many different contexts. Tapu functions as a means of social control in Māori society, but it's complemented by this concept of noa, which is said to remove the restrictions imposed by tapu. And women historically play a really important part in tikanga Māori, as they're invested with the power to whakanoa, which means to make noa or to remove the restrictions of tapu. And Ani Makaire in her work gives this example. I'm just going to quote the following process, which gives an example of this, of the importance of the feminine and removing the power of tapu. In former times, she says, When warriors returned from the field of battle, it was customary for the tapu of blood to be lifted from them by their crawling between the legs of wahine, a woman elder elected for the task. So again, there's a relation, there's a power here, which is a sexuate power. And there's a capacity here in Te Ao Māori, or the Māori world, to mediate the boundary between life and death, to open the passage of the doorways between worlds. The final way I'll just talk about this is through Māori language. And this return to language is really important. It's also why scholars, like a lot of scholars like Lucy Regere, for example, spend a lot of time talking about language and linguistics and the way that sexual difference is kind of erased through language. And I think we can see this really clearly in these examples of Māori language. So in Māori language, just a few words here. The word whānau is a really important word that connotes family. It means family, but it also means, the same word also means the act of giving birth or being born. And similarly, the word hapu, which is an important kind of sub-tribe or group of people who you're connected to through your genealogy, also means being pregnant. The word whenua means land, which is, of course, central to Māori culture, and genealogy also means placenta. And finally, this word atua, which means, refers to a deity, spiritual deity, but also is used to refer to menstrual blood, which in Māori culture has had pre-colonisation a very important and spiritual function, and wasn't coded in the way it is in the Western symbolic as waste, as it is kind of coded now. So I've talked a lot about these things. You might be wondering, how does this relate to rape and to resistance to rape? Well, I think that there's a really important critical feminist anti-rape praxis that comes from this mana wahine scholarship that I've highlighted. So if we're to understand, as I've argued that we should, rape as being a gendered harm and one that's contingent on, for its harm, on the denigration and erasure of the feminine and the imposition of colonial matrices of desire, we need to think resistance to rape and epistemic resistance to rape that addresses these aspects. And so for these reasons, I argue that feminist anti-rape scholarship needs to look beyond, as I said before, the act of rape, the act of sexual violence as its point of departure. And instead, it needs to orientate itself around radical ontologies of sexual being or sexual subjectivity that offer an alternative through those, to those through which rape culture currently proliferates. And I think that we can see this in this account of the feminine sexual difference that comes from the Māori feminist scholarship I've highlighted here. And that's because this figure that we see emerging, or the sexuate subject we see emerging, is transcendent. But it's also necessary in conjunction with the masculine, but also with other vitalities and elements to ensure balance. But also it's possessed of its own energy, its own sexuate energy, which draws on and is profoundly linked to, essentially linked to, all elements of Māori life and cosmogony. So when we see the feminine re-emerge from mana wahine in this way, it makes it easier, I think, to see how sexual violence is understood in pre-colonial Māori society as a profoundly serious crime that is said to destroy the whole community. And we can see why it is when we look at a different type of metaphysics in which the feminine has its own identity, has its own power, has its own sexuate subjectivity. It's not simply derived or an aberration or a complement of the masculine, as we see in Western metaphysics. So resisting then the decolonial, or resisting the colonial construction of the feminine and engaging in the activist praxis of decolonisation, and of, as Huia Murphy says it, and I'm quoting her here, by rethreading the feminine strands in the spiritual fabric of our world, unquote. This necessarily, I say, is necessarily anti-rape praxis. So what I'm trying to advocate here is for a critical continuity between how we diagnose or understand the harm of rape and sexual violence and our constructive project or our resistance project. So if we see the harm of rape to the sexuate identity of women, then how we get to the end or how we resist has to be by the same route. We have to address the elements of the harm. And I think that Maori mana wahine offers these other ways of knowing under which alternative subject positions might emerge or re-emerge, which challenge the ubiquity or inevitability of rape and rape culture. So in this sense, challenging rape doesn't start with self-defense or indeed with prohibitive laws necessarily, because these don't necessarily challenge the status quo of the masculine symbolic order or of monosexual desire at its core. First, we have to address or identify the point at which difference, and in this case, the feminine sexual difference of being is erased from history, and bring it back or demand that it's returned. And in this way, I think that we're thinking through sexual difference in order to displace the ruling symbolic order in which the masculine identity dictates the boundaries of our sexual subject and of desire, and which maintains scaffolding, as Nicola Gavey would say, of rape culture. Okay, so I think I'll leave it there. I hope it was useful for those who made it through to the end, and I hope to see you at the CLC in Dundee.